So to kind of bring all of this together, what we've seen when we see, the division between Jekyll and Hyde, the front house, the back house, the upper story, the lower story, Soho, the bad neighborhood, the upper class neighborhood where Jekyll leads, all of this division, the higher self, the lower self, how does it all sort of come together, right? One of the things that we talked about before is Utterson, who's a lawyer, right? Friends with people, sometimes who are on their way down in the social standing. He's the example of a truly good person because he is someone who circulates, right? He doesn't just go on constitutional walks, but in terms of his morality and his awareness of what society needs to be, he's someone who travels to Soho, not for pleasure, but who will travel to Soho, who will travel in these byways, someone who is not closing his eyes or blinded to the plight of fellow human beings. As we said earlier, Hitchcock, in his movie Psycho, talks about the idea how there's a relationship between the superego and the id, the highest level of the consciousness, the thing that makes us behave, and then the repressed parts, the things all the way down, the survival instinct. In the same way, the union between these two different areas and all of these kind of comparing ideas in the symbolism of Jekyll and Hyde show the idea on the level of class and social ills that the lower class and the criminal element, right, is created by the upper class. Now, when we talked about Animal Farm and we talked about the bourgeoisie, right? We remember this, right? When in the Industrial Revolution, when the bourgeoisie and the upper classes, the people who owned all the production capital, they were creating untold amounts of misery by making money off the backs of the poor and not sharing it with anyone. So what Robert Louis Stevenson, even though he wasn't writing from a Freudian perspective, thinking about, okay, repression is what causes all of this dysfunction, what he does seem to be indicating is that the upper class, to a certain extent, is responsible for the creation of the modern lower class, the modern poor. Because the thing is, right, this idea of the modern poor was not something that really existed before industrialization. There were always poor people. Most poor people were farmers, people just barely getting by. But the idea of massive amounts of people living in squalor, living in places that were filled with rats and crime and prostitution and all these other things, these things were mainly, and by the way, there had always been cities and there had always been people in cities, and cities have always been hovels of crime and poverty and desperation. That's nothing new. But through most of history, the vast majority of human beings didn't live in cities. Those who were poor wouldn't want to live in cities because it was a terrible place to be poor. Industrialization really changed that. The movement of industrialization, and this was true particularly in America, it changed the population dynamic from rural to urban, right? And so just as the Freudian might argue that the superego, by its repressiveness, creates like these backlashes of the id, these outbursts of the id out of repression, a similar argument on a social level is being made by Jekyll and Hyde in the idea that since Hyde is the creation of Dr. Jekyll, and since these modern horrible places like Soho are created by the factories in the modern industrial age, it seems that they are the products of the rich. They are the products of the bourgeoisie. So in the same thing, right, is that there are different kinds of crime, of course, but if you, to use a quote from Ra's al Ghul in Batman Begins, played by Sir Liam Neeson, if you create enough hunger, everyone becomes a thief, right? This, by the way, is another idea that's explored in Victor Hugo's famous novel Les Miserables. What's the difference, right, between poverty and criminality when you basically force people to be criminals to survive? In the same way, right, and we remember that the id is the survival instinct if we ask Freud, the thing that we need to understand about Jekyll and Hyde is that typically when we talked about evil in the Victorian period, evil, people were just born evil, right? People were evil because they were born that way, or they were a bad seed, or that they were somehow less evolved, or vices degenerated them to become slightly less than human, all of these different things. But one of the major things that's happening in this literary period is the idea that criminals aren't necessarily born, and not everything that happens to people and what they become when they become monsters is necessarily the product of their personal choices. A lot of it is the influences and the things that happen to them. Now, this is not to excuse Edward Hyde, who's actually Dr. Jekyll, but it is to excuse the idea that a lot of the poverty and criminality and perversion is created by the imbalances of wealth and also by the repressive culture, right? The idea of the lack of empathy for the poor, the lack of circulation. It's basically if you tie off a part, if you cut off the blood circulation to any part of your body, it'll rot off. That's exactly what will happen. And in this way, one of the things that Robert Louis Stevenson is trying to suggest is that evil does not exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the corruption of the good. And if it comes from the corruption of the good, that means to some extent, good people can even be at least somewhat responsible in creating evil or creating the conditions that allow evil to flourish. And in this way, Jekyll and Hyde is very much a critique of the environment that is being going on. And he does it with some fairly obvious but really deep and complex symbolism once you do a deep dive into it. So the reason why I talk about all these different themes and theories today is because it was a rather short reading and there wasn't a lot of content in terms of the plot, but it seemed like a good time to talk about some of these ideas and where these ideas come from and how we interpret this as a literary work. So there's technically only one more lecture before we get to the Holy Triduum, and that's this really big final event of the plot right before we read the Confessions from Lanyon and Jekyll. And that'll be the last reading of this week. The quiz will be on Thursday. Until then, Jesus loves you, so do I. And I hope that, oh wait, this was for the Tuesday of Holy Week. Man, when you do a lot of these and different ones in different days, it can be a little confusing. But I believe this is for Tuesday of Holy Week, so you only have one more to go for the week. Anyway, Jesus loves you, so do I, and I hope you guys are having a great day.